The Climate Action Reserve is the most experienced and trusted offset registry to serve the carbon markets. As more organizations look to combat climate change and support environmental projects with true integrity, they turn to the reserve to foster real solutions and reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. We are excited to kick off the second series of Carbon Connection and feature external partners with insights and expertise in particular climate sectors and topics across the carbon market. I am your host, Lauren Napuk, and thank you for joining us. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our next episode of Carbon Connection. Today, we are speaking with Justin Johnson, who is a partner at MMR. Justin joined MMR in 2016, bringing with him more than 20 years of experience working in federal, state, and municipal government in both the United States and Australia. Today, we are speaking with Justin about compliance markets, specifically the developments that have been underway, including things such as pricing, new players, projected growth, and potential impacts of these compliance markets. Justin, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Lauren. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Now, Justin, to kick us off, first, what is the importance of compliance markets in the world of climate change?
Well, so let me just say, obviously, I'm a big fan of compliance markets. I spent a number of years in Vermont state government and was part of the original team at the state level that helped develop the RGGI program here in Vermont. And so I have both an affinity for and a real confidence in compliance markets. And in my role, particularly sort of consulting with IETA, the International Emissions Trading Association, over the last few years, obviously we see markets as a really critical part of the overall sort of climate plan. And so I would say that, compliance markets are really critical in that they provide both a sort of lead, a way for people to see what's possible in the market, but also they help, I think, to sustain the role of markets generally as a mechanism for carbon pricing and therefore for ultimately affecting changes that will help us reduce emissions. And I say that because, obviously compliance market is mandatory on the people who are involved in it when it gets passed through a regulation of a law or a law. And so that really creates a sort of backstop for these markets and gives people an opportunity to both understand what you can do with them, but also it sort of, let's be real, it locks certain people into the markets. And I think that then provides an opportunity for people to worry less about where they should be there or should not be there and more about how to make it work.
Thank you, Justin. That was such a wonderful summary. And in your opinion, what makes a successful compliance market?
Well, as I said, the compliance markets are essentially regulated. And so the folks who are covered and obligated by compliance markets range from people who are very interested and really involved. We have speculative players, you have compliance entities that might be, electric generators or other emitters who are brought into the market. I think the thing that is incumbent upon governments and those who are actually putting the markets in place is to be predictable and fair and really clearly state their intent, both in what the market is for and what the rules of that market are. And this is not just because it's important for the individual players who are going to have real money at stake and businesses at stake within the market and with that carbon pricing system, but also, frankly, create confidence and allow the market to work as it should. Um, if it's working properly, it should not be about whether the market administrator is going to do some strange thing or change the rules at the last minute. It's going to be about what is the cheapest, most efficient and effective way to reduce emissions and how can the market help to do that. So I'd say that predictability is the most important thing, but transparency is important. strong monitoring and verification is important, and longevity and stability is important.
Thank you, Justin. These are very critical to ensuring, like you're saying, confidence in the market, having that transparency and accessibility of people to be able to enter the market itself. So, thank you for that. And what are the compliance markets in North America that are currently operating? And would you be able to give a brief overview of each of them?
Yeah, well, there are a few. There's not a ton. And I think interestingly, that question about longevity and stability, we don't have a really long history of the markets yet. I think we'll get there, but the Reggie market, which I mentioned, was the first one, but it's also a very small one in the sense that it only covers electric generation of 25 megawatts and above. And so it's a small portion of the economy. Um, it is closely followed by California, the WCI market, which is actually quite a big one and comprehensive, covers, I think, close to 85% of the economy in California. And so they're quite different in a lot of ways. And then Washington State is the next one. And when we sort of look at statewide and more comprehensive, it is similar to California. I think that as the newest program, it's got a ways to go. And frankly, they all have a ways to go. And I think that's why, I sort of come back to stability and transparency and predictability as these markets evolve and develop, which they're all still doing. That's really important. But apart from Reggie, California, Washington, there's a small program in Oregon that covers fuels. There's a Massachusetts program. Massachusetts is part of Reggie, but also has a program that goes lower, like below 25 megawatts. And North Carolina has talked about it. Virginia is technically in Reggie, but is likely to leave. Pennsylvania would like to be in, but isn't quite because of some court action. And there's a lot of moving parts. I'll give a little plug for the state of Vermont, which has just passed what they call clean heat standard, which covers just heating fuels. But there's also a bill currently in the legislature here in Vermont that would include fuels, like transportation fuels, hasn't been passed yet. There's a lot of conversation about what might happen next. But the other thing, I guess, just to summarize for the US, there are some things happening at the federal level as well. And that's also a lot to get into. But I would say, generally speaking, the action at the state level is in large part because there is no comprehensive federal program. Unlike the EU ETS in Europe, we don't have a comprehensive federal program. And so I think you'll continue to see states developing these programs, and most of the action will be at the state level in the coming years.
That's super fascinating, especially with a country as vast and large as the United States, having these states kind of pick up what the federal government largely is not providing. And each one of them, as you mentioned, growing and evolving every day. And there's lots of work to be done. So that's all very exciting to hear.
I should add that whilst they don't have it yet, perhaps the big one, the one that everyone is thinking about now, is New York, where they have passed the regulation and are currently in the early sort of pre-rulemaking stages of developing an economy-wide cap and invest program in New York State. It is a little early yet. We haven't seen any actual sort of written details, but they've had a number of webinars and things, and a lot of questions have been raised, and a lot of like, what direction should we go? They're likely in New York to look heavily to California, which I think I would support. I think my colleagues at AIDA would support. One of the downsides of having the states do this work is the risk that you end up with 50 different programs that are all just different enough that it makes it difficult for particularly bigger companies who are involved, have activities in a number of states, to just be efficient about how to deal with it. If we had one program, there'd be one set of rules. And so they'd be able to track it really easy. There'd be one price and it would make it really efficient. Now, that's not going to happen. We have more than one program, but try to keep them as close together. And I'm sure later on we can talk a bit about linkage. But I think that's one of the challenges that the states have is how do they do what works for individual states, but also bring them together in a way that makes it possible for the players, and whether they be compliance entities or speculative players, to actually understand and sort of be able to efficiently work out which is the best way to go forward. Yeah.
Definitely. And Justin, you mentioned linkage. So would you be able to touch on that a little? So with, for example, the state of New York now creating this new program on its own, do we assume that New York is talking to these other entities out there in the United States and gaining knowledge from them? Or are they kind of operating on their own?
Uh, I think to answer that question, I think we assume they're talking to them. I know they're talking to them. They're talking to California. They're talking to Washington. Your California has already linked with Quebec. What was originally the Western Climate Initiative, or WCI, which Quebec doesn't seem like it would immediately fit into, they did ultimately join with California. And I think that has been a really great example of how linkage can work. For instance, it shows that you don't have to be right next to each other for a link to work. But yeah, I think ever since states started thinking about these programs, the question of linkage has come up. I know very early on in my involvement with cap and trade or cap and invest programs, there was a lot of promise that the states would be able to link. We'd have WCI, we'd maybe have the Reggie region, maybe one other region that we'd all link together. These things are not easy to do. There's politics, there's timing, there's the technical details, but I'm confident that what New York is doing right now is they're talking to California, not necessarily so that the New York program is the same as California's, but to make sure that whatever design elements go into the New York program would not preclude them either for linking there or with Washington possibly, and would make it as easy as possible. Um, and there's a lot of work has been done around the country on how you would do linkage. I think originally when that came up, it was thought that the programs would have to be almost identical. And I think that's not necessarily the case. There are some pieces that would have to be close, but they don't have to be the same. And I do think that linkage is in our future.
That's really exciting. And thank you so much for sharing that with us because it gives us hope to look on the horizon for where these states are going and hopefully having this cross collaboration in terms of sharing knowledge, expertise, and lessons learned as well.
And there are some really good reasons to link too. I mean, back to the whole concept of markets and using a market as a way to set a price on carbon and reduce at the most efficient and lowest price possible. The bigger the market, the more reduction opportunities are available to folks who are playing in that market. The better the price discovery can be, you get to look at perhaps sort of all over the country for the best ways to reduce emissions as opposed to just narrowly what's right in front of you. I know that this has been controversial in some corners just around the idea that you would somehow reduce carbon in one place, and which would not be as a direct benefit to individuals who might be right there in traditionally overburdened communities at home. And I think that that's something that all of these markets have gotten better at. And they're looking at those things and looking at how you can make sure that the benefits accrue to everybody, and particularly accrue to overburdened or underserved communities who have perhaps missed out in the past or have had to carry the burden of the emissions in previous years. And this is an opportunity to try and right some of that. I don't think any of those things necessarily at odds with having a market as a way to find the best, most effective emissions reduction strategies. So I think that's incumbent upon the program designers to work out how to make sure that those benefits are getting to the places they need to get.
That's a really fantastic point. We at the Reserve, especially, are talking about co benefits of projects and how we can ensure that our offsets are serving communities in these places that reductions may or may not be happening. So this is really critical piece. And looking at compliance markets and emissions reductions, are there specific sectors or project types that you see as more prominent within the United States?
Certainly from where I am, we've done a really good job with the electric sector. There's a couple of reasons for that. Probably the most basic is that it was already incredibly regulated. We know a lot about it, and the players, the entities that are creating the emissions are relatively small in number. So we sort of know who they are, we know what they're doing. And it's a lot easier to wrap your arms around that. Contrast that to transportation, which I think is the really tough one, sort of at the other end of the scale. In states like Vermont and New York and many others, transportation emissions make up close to half of the emissions in some states. They're right up there. And it's more difficult because depending on how you look at it, those emissions are coming from either outside the jurisdiction altogether, maybe in an oil field in another country, or they're coming from every gas station in the state or every car that drives around. I mean, the actual emission is coming from each car. That's a lot of individuals. And I think most people would agree that it's unwieldy to sort of require every car owner to have a permit to emit from that. So the question is, what's the best way to do that? It's somewhere between maybe too far upstream and too far downstream. In there somewhere is a sweet spot. And I think we're all still working on that. I know that's one of the things that New York is looking at right now. Where in that sort of chain of involvement in the process should the obligation occur? It comes up a lot. California does it. Of course, the beauty of California is that not only is it a single state, but it has refineries. It makes a lot of its own fuel and that sort of thing. So that helps to simplify it a little. New York is a single state, but it imports a lot of its fuel. The other New England states, Vermont, Maine, they don't make any of their own fuel. They bring it in from somewhere. And Reggie's a good example. And Reggie is multiple states working together. So just the levels of complication ramp up pretty fast. And so I think to really crack this nut, we have to deal with transportation. And there are other things too. There's home heating. In the Northeast here, we use a lot of oil. That's a challenge. There's industrial sites. But again, I think that as you work back from transportation sort of to electric generation, doesn't mean it gets easy, but it gets easier. And that's sort of reflected in how we see the programs having been developed over the last 15 or 20 years.
Wow, that's super interesting to think about as well. Looking at a state like California, who has such a huge economy, they're producing their own power, all the way to thinking about yourself on that individual level, driving your car and how emissions reductions need to happen. So, looking at compliance markets as that solution to figure out the best way forward. And with the compliance market, a topic that a lot of people tend to be interested in are prices and how prices are set for these credits. So I was wondering what you could share a little bit on the current trend of pricing and what you see in your day to day.
So traditionally, these markets have tended to start relatively long. So, there's always been a concern that, wow, we don't want to push prices too high. And so allowances have been fairly readily available. Although Washington State perhaps argues against that a little bit because Washington State is a pretty tight market right out of the gate. And we've seen some increase in prices there. Now, some of that is real. I think some of it, frankly, is people taking advantage of the noise around the introduction of the market. And I know that Washington is looking pretty closely at that. But the challenge, of course, is when you set a cap, at what level do you set that cap? I mean, New York's going through this right now. It's always tough, but generally speaking, I would say that prices, which have been relatively stable, the last year or so, although like any market, rumors and information sends people off in different directions. California announced a workshop on what's going to happen next year, and suddenly the price went up, and they had the webinar, and there was a lot of earth shaking news. And so the price came down again, and then they announced another one and the price went up a little bit. In Reggie, we've had program reviews where the announcement of the program review and a reduction in the cap has sent the price up. But generally speaking, the trend in prices is upward. And I would say that is because the task at hand, whilst we've made some progress, we're not there yet. And the early things to do are perhaps some of the easier things to do. And I think the governments and the states that have implemented these programs have seen some gains, seen some improvement, but they're not there yet. And so we have more work to do. And I think ultimately that will drive up prices. There will always be noise in that. For instance, last year there was a bit of a spike in Reggie prices because of the war in Ukraine meant that we saw natural gas being diverted from the traditional markets in the Northeast to Europe. And the concern was if we have a really cold winter, then everyone's going to be burning oil and that's going to increase emissions. As it happened, we had a pretty mild winter. And so the price kind of went up a little bit and then it dropped back. I think that dynamic is going to be similar this year. I mean, if you're on the East Coast and you look at electricity, just look at the temperature and you'll get a sense of emissions. There's more going on the West Coast, with Washington, California having more comprehensive programs that cover more of the economy. There's some room to move things around within that. And then there's complementary policies. Whenever you do a low carbon fuel standard or you ban gas stoves, which is what New York is looking at, those things will lower emissions without having to do anything necessarily in the cap and trade program. So all of those things together will have an impact. But I think if you look big picture, the price goes up, albeit not rapidly, but does go up over the next few years as we really start to get into the nitty gritty of how you actually reduce emissions and paying for that.
Wow, that's super interesting to think about because we have to recognize that there will be new policies and changes that we can't necessarily expect. Like you mentioned, the war on Ukraine and how that was affecting natural gas prices. So, looking at the global spectrum of emissions and how it could impact compliance markets here on the East Coast or on the West Coast within the United States. And talking about these evolving markets, I'm interested in your perspectives for what the future of the North American compliance market can look like. And can we expect more players to enter as these programs continue to develop?
So I would say yes, is my really short answer to that is I think, that patience is going to be necessary. Anyone who's been involved in these markets knows that it's not a straight line from here to whatever's next. We tend to have lots of little side tracks and progress is made. We lose a bit. We make progress. In Reggie, we had New Jersey in, then they left, then they came back. And the bottom line is that politics plays a huge role in a lot of this. That these markets create scarcity where it doesn't necessarily actually exist in the real world. And so we're somewhat at the whims of governments that create the scarcity to sort of maintain that scarcity. But I say yes, because I think that climate change and the impacts becoming more and more obvious to more and more people. It's been a rough 6 months in Europe and the US. In my state of Vermont, we had floods, the water's barely subsided, and we have the terrible fires in Hawaii. Europe has been baking all summer. I think every time those sorts of things happen, people are reminded that we still have a problem to solve. And I think that ultimately, the markets provide a way to get capital to solve that problem. And there's more than one way to do it, and we'll probably have to use something of everything. But I think that these market based programs are really both well understood in the big picture and critical part of the solution. And more states are going to ultimately see that and find ways to make them work. So I think in the future, you'll see more states joining, but it's not going to be easy. We're seeing it right now in Pennsylvania and Virginia. The whole political sort of realm to this is ultimately still a huge challenge. Makes it very hard for people who are investing through these markets because they don't really know what's going to happen next. That's a big risk, but we'll see more of them because we have to solve the problem.
Absolutely. You're 100% right. Climate change is our global problem right now. And so finding more solutions and trying to fix these challenges and bringing more folks into the circle so that we can fight climate change, I think is so important. And with these new players entering, what would be some advice that you could recommend for entering the North American compliance market?
Well, so as I mentioned, I think patience is a real important part of that because I don't think that they're necessarily going to happen quickly or uniformly or in a straight line. It's going to be a matter of really watching and learning, keeping a close eye on the ultimate goal is really important. There's a lot of noise around these things. The success of these markets ultimately will be both in having, as we talked about, predictable market structure, but also I'll put a plug in here for quality investments. You know, invest in things that you can understand and have some expectation actually going to solve the problem. There's been a lot of talk around offsets and verification and those sorts of things. Most of these programs have some kind of offsetting mechanism. New York has talked about not having one at all, in part, I think, because of reaction to this idea that there's a lot of variability in the quality of some of those offsets. But as a player, as a speculative player in these markets, I would say that you got to treat it like any other investment. You got to do your homework. You got to understand what it is. Make sure you understand how they get to the numbers, whoever it is that's selling that, and then understand what it is that the program's trying to achieve and how they set it up. And if that doesn't work for you, then you might want to pause before you invest in it. But I think there will also be a ton of opportunities going forward, and states are going to be really looking to find ways to make those markets bigger. So patience and opportunity, I think.
That is a really fantastic point to leave us with, Justin, in that we see these markets are growing and there's going to be new opportunities, but also be patient and wait for that right time to either enter or understand how to get into this compliance market. And that, Justin, will bring us to a close of this episode. And I just want to thank you so much for your time today and sharing the ins and outs of the compliance markets of the North American continent.
No problem. Thank you so much for your time. It was fun.